I'm Margaret Peterson, 81 years old, a woman, and my son sold the home my husband built for me to pay for my granddaughter's wedding. He didn't ask me. He didn't even tell me. I found out when I drove 2 hours to open the windows and air out the memories for the summer, only to find a garish red and white, sold, sign hammered into the lawn my husband, Robert, had so carefully seeded and tended for 40 years. The sign was an exclamation point at the end of a sentence I didn't know had been written. A sentence that declared my life, my memories, and my future were nothing more than collateral for a party. This isn't just a story about a house. It's a story about the slow, creeping rot of entitlement, and how the people you love most can sometimes become strangers who know exactly which floorboards to pry up to get to the valuables hidden underneath. My life before the sign was a quiet one. I live in a modest two-bedroom bungalow in the city, the kind with a small, manageable garden and neighbors who wave but don't pry. It's comfortable, but it was never my heart's home. My heart lived 2 hours north, nestled in a grove of pine trees overlooking the still, dark waters of Crystal Lake. The lake house. Robert built it with his own 2 hands, with some help from his friends on the weekends, the year our son, David, was born. He'd come home on Friday evenings, his hands calloused and his face flushed with exhaustion and pride, smelling of sawdust and fresh paint. He'd pull me into his arms and whisper, "I put up another wall today, Maggie, a wall for our boy's room. One day he'll bring his own children there." The house was our testament. It wasn't grand. It had 2 bedrooms, a large open living room with a stone fireplace Robert laid himself, and a screened-in porch that hung over the water. Every plank of wood, every pane of glass was a monument to our shared life. It was where David took his first steps on the thick bare rug in front of the fire. It was where he and his father learned to fish, their quiet figures silhouetted against the sunrise on the dock. It was where I taught him to swim, his small, trusting hand clutching mine as he kicked his feet in the cold, clear water. When David married Linda, I was overjoyed. Linda was polished. She had a way of making everything seem more sophisticated, more important. Her clothes were always perfectly pressed, her hair never out of place. At first, I mistook her ambition for drive. I thought she would be good for David, who had always been a bit of a dreamer like his father, but without Robert's practical grit. Linda was all grit. She encouraged David to leave his father's small construction business and go into finance. "That's where the real money is, David," I remember her saying at a Sunday dinner, patting his hand. "Building things is noble, but it doesn't pay for a good life." Robert had been hurt by that, though he never said it aloud. He saw his work as building legacies, not just houses. Linda saw it as dirty fingernails and a small paycheck. She was the one who insisted they move to the most expensive suburb, the one who enrolled their daughter, Chloe, in private schools and ballet classes and equestrian camps. I never judged them for it. A grandmother's love is a powerful and often blinding thing. I wanted them to be happy, and if happiness came with a hefty price tag, I was in no position to argue. I was just the quiet old woman in the bungalow, the keeper of the lake house, a quaint relic from a simpler time. My relationship with my granddaughter, Chloe, was my life's great joy after Robert passed. From the moment she was born, I saw a spark of my Robert in her eyes. But as she grew, that spark was buried under layers of designer clothes and a sense of expectation that I found bewildering. Her childhood visits to the lake house were frequent at first, but as she entered her teens, they dwindled. The lake was boring. There was no cell service. Her friends were all going to Europe or the Caribbean for the summer. The last time she'd visited, 2 years ago, she'd spent the entire weekend sighing dramatically and scrolling through her phone, complaining about the mosquitoes. Still, I held on to the belief that underneath the veneer Linda had so carefully applied, my family was still my family. I ignored the warning signs. There was the time, about 5 years ago, when David asked to borrow a significant amount of money. "It's just a temporary cash flow problem, Mom," he'd said, his voice strained over the phone. A deal fell through. Linda's worried about keeping Chloe in her riding academy. I gave him the money from my savings, the nest egg Robert and I had built. He paid it back, but 6 months later than he promised, and without a word of thanks. It was just an expectation fulfilled. Then there was the matter of the power of attorney. After a minor health scare 3 years ago, David and Linda had sat me down. It was Linda who did the talking. "Margaret, we need to be practical," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "If something were to happen to you, we need to be able to manage your affairs, pay your bills. It's just a piece of paper for emergencies." I was 78 and had just spent 2 nights in a hospital. I was vulnerable. I trusted my only son. I signed the papers without reading the fine print, the very thing Robert had always warned me against. "Never sign anything without Arthur looking at it first," he'd say. But Robert was gone, and I didn't want to bother his old friend Arthur Finch with a simple family matter. It was a mistake that would cost me everything. The third week of May was always the week. It was a sacred entry in my calendar, marked in red ink for the past 15 years since Robert's passing. Open the lake house. It was more than a chore, it was a pilgrimage. It was the official end of the long gray winter and the beginning of life, of color, of memories revisited. The ritual was always the same, a comforting liturgy of preparation. I'd spend the day before packing. Not much, just a small suitcase with comfortable clothes, a few good books I'd been saving, and a thick cardigan for the cool lake nights. The most important items went into a separate canvas bag. A framed photo of Robert and me on the porch, taken the year it was finished. A bag of his favorite coffee beans, which I'd grind fresh in the old hand-crank grinder. And a new box of the expensive dark chocolates Linda always scoffed at. "Nobody eats those, Margaret," she'd say, but I did. They were my small indulgence. This year the preparation was tinged with a strange melancholy. 2 days before my planned departure, Linda had called. Her voice was a whirlwind of frantic energy. "Margaret, you will not believe the cost of these floral arrangements. The caterer just sent over the final invoice for the tasting menu and I nearly fainted. It's for Chloe, of course, so it has to be perfect. But honestly, $120,000 disappears so fast." I clutched the phone, my knuckles white. $120,000, Linda, that's a house." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "It's the price of a perfect day, Margaret, the price of giving Chloe the start she deserves. You can't put a price on that." I didn't know what to say. The number echoed in the quiet of my bungalow, obscene and nonsensical. Robert and I had built our entire lives on less than that. But I just murmured something about how I was sure it would be a beautiful day, because that's what you do. You smooth things over, you don't make waves. You're the grandmother, the steady, smiling presence in the background of their perfect, expensive life. The morning of my trip, I woke before dawn. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. I made my coffee, drank it while watching the sun paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, and felt a sense of peace settle over me. The anxiety from Linda's call faded, replaced by the familiar anticipation of the journey. I loaded my bags into my old, reliable sedan, placing the canvas tote with Robert's picture on the passenger seat beside me. It was as if he was coming with me. The 2-hour drive was a meditation. The city's concrete maze gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to rolling farmland, and finally to the dense green forests of the north. I knew every turn, every landmark. There was the old dairy farm with the crooked silo, the antique shop with the rusty bicycle out front, and the small town of Pine Ridge, the last stop before the lake. I drove through it slowly, waving to the owner of the general store who was out sweeping his porch. As I turned off the main highway onto the winding county road, I rolled down my window. The air changed. It was cleaner, sharper, scented with pine and water. My heart beat a little faster. This was the final leg of the journey. This was the road home. My mind was already there. I pictured myself unlocking the heavy oak door, the familiar click of the tumbler echoing in the still air. I'd throw open the windows to let the breeze chase away the stale, wintry smell. I'd sweep the porch, fill the bird feeder, and then, with a cup of freshly brewed coffee, I'd sit in the old wicker chair and just be. My thoughts drifted to David. I wondered if he ever missed this. Did he ever miss the smell of the pine needles after a rainstorm, or the sound of the loons calling across the water at dusk? Or had Linda's world of catered parties and financial statements scrubbed those simple pleasures from his memory? I felt a pang of sadness for him, for the things I believed he had lost. The final turn was onto the private gravel lane that served the 4 houses on our stretch of the lake. The tires crunched over the stones, a sound as familiar as my own heartbeat. My little house was at the very end of the lane, tucked away and hidden from the road. The anticipation was a knot in my sea. I rounded the last bend, my eyes fixed on the spot where the weathered gray siding of the house should have appeared through the trees. And then I saw it. It wasn't the house. It was a flash of red, a bold, angry gash against the tranquil green and gray. My foot eased off the accelerator, the car slowing to a crawl. My mind couldn't process it. It was a sign. A large, professionally printed sign hammered into the center of the lawn. It had one word printed in huge, white block letters. Sold. The car idled for a full minute. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the frantic, useless thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I stared at the sign, my brain refusing to assemble the letters into the word I knew they formed. SOLD. It looked alien, an artifact from another world dropped into the middle of mine. It couldn't be right. It was a mistake. Maybe it was for the neighbor's house and the realtor had gotten the properties mixed up. Yes, that had to be it. Mr. Henderson was getting on in years. Maybe he'd finally decided to sell. I turned off the ignition, the sudden silence making the ringing in my ears even louder. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my seatbelt. I pushed the car door open and stepped out onto the gravel. My legs felt like they were made of cotton. Each step toward the sign was a monumental effort, as if I were wading through deep water. The air was still thick with the scent of pine, but now it felt cloying, suffocating. I reached the sign and touched it. The metal was cold and smooth beneath my trembling fingertips. It was real. It was staked deep into the earth, a permanent fixture. Under the word sold, in smaller letters, was the name of a realty company I didn't recognize. Lakeside Premier Properties. It sounded expensive and impersonal, nothing like the local, family-run real estate office in Pine Ridge. My gaze lifted from the sign to the house. My house. It looked the same, yet entirely different. It was like seeing a beloved friend in a casket. The form was there, but the life was gone. The windows were dark and vacant. The bird feeder I always kept full was empty, swinging gently in the breeze. A padlock, thick and industrial, was latched onto the front door, a brutal piece of hardware against the warm, familiar oak. Denial gave way to a wave of cold, nauseating panic. I fumbled in my purse for my phone, my fingers clumsy and disobedient. I had to call someone. I had to call David. He would sort this out. He would laugh and say there was some ridiculous mix-up, and he'd make a few angry calls and it would all be fixed. He was my son. He was the boy I'd taught to skip stones on this very lake. I scrolled through my contacts, his name a blur on the screen. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. My breath hitched in my throat with each ring. Hi, you've reached David Peterson. I'm unable to take your call right now. Please leave a message. His voice, so calm, so normal, so completely detached from the wreckage I was standing in. I tried again. Voicemail. I tried Linda. Voicemail. I tried Chloe. Her voicemail was a sing-songy, giggling message. Hey, can't talk, probably doing something fabulous, text me. Fabulous? The word was a punch in the gut. I leaned against the rough bark of a pine tree for support, the world tilting on its axis. I was alone. Utterly, completely alone, standing in front of a sold sign on a property I owned, locked out of a house filled with 40 years of my life, unable to reach the very people who were supposed to be my family. I sank down onto the damp ground, heedless of the dirt or the pine needles. The canvas bag with Robert's photo had tipped over in the car, and I could see his smiling face through the window. His eyes so full of love and pride. I put up another wall today, Maggie, a wall for our boys' room. The memory was a shard of glass in my heart. David hadn't just sold a house. He'd desold the walls his father built. He'd sold the fireplace where we'd warmed our hands after ice skating. He'd sold the porch where we'd watched 1,000 sunsets. How? The question hammered at me. How could this happen? I own this house. The deed was in my name, free and clear, tucked away in my safe deposit box in the city. No one could sell it but me. And then a memory surfaced, cold and sharp. The papers I'd signed 3 years ago, the power of attorney. It's just a piece of paper, Margaret, for emergencies. Linda's smooth, reassuring voice echoed in my head, but now it sounded sinister, predatory. Was this their emergency? A wedding? A party that cost more than this house, this life, this history was ever worth. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture so monstrous I couldn't bear to look at it, yet I couldn't look away. The vague talk of money problems, the constant, escalating pressure of Chloe's wedding, the obscene number Linda had thrown at me over the phone. It was a complaint, it was a confession. I sat there on the cold ground for what felt like hours, watching the sun climb higher in the sky until the shadows of the pine trees grew short. The initial shock slowly curdled into a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. My son, my David, he had taken my past and sold it to finance his daughter's future, and he hadn't even had the courage to tell me. It was late afternoon when my phone finally buzzed. I was still sitting in my car, the engine cold, the canvas bag with Robert's picture now clutched in my lap like a shield. The caller ID read David. For a moment I just stared at it, a hot surge of adrenaline mixing with the cold dread in my stomach. I pressed the answer button, my hand steady now. The grief had frozen into a kind of brittle clarity. "Mom, I got your messages. Is everything okay?" His voice was casual, almost breezy, as if he were asking about the weather. I couldn't speak. I opened my mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. "Mom, are you there?" A flicker of irritation entered his tone. I took a breath. "I'm at the lake, David." There was a pause, a silence so heavy I could feel the weight of it through the phone. I could hear faint sounds in the background, the clink of a glass, a woman's muffled voice. Linda, she was there, listening. "Oh," he finally said. The word was small, flat. You went up early this year." "The sign is very nice," I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant to my ears. "Very professional, lakeside premier properties. Is it a good company?" Another silence. This one was longer, charged with the unspoken truth. I could picture him perfectly, running a hand through his thinning hair, looking helplessly at his wife, who was no doubt making sharp, angry gestures at him. "Get it over with." "Mom, listen," he began, his voice taking on a placating tone that set my teeth on edge. "I was going to tell you, we were going to tell you." "Tell me what, David?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "That you sold my house, the house your father built, or were you just going to send me a change of address card?" "It's not like that," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "It's complicated. The market was at its peak. It was a fantastic offer. We couldn't pass it up." "We?" I repeated. "Who is we, David? Last I checked, the deed to this house had my name on it, and your father's, not yours, not Linda's." "The power of attorney, Mom," he said, his voice dropping as if it were a distasteful but necessary detail. "It gave me the authority to manage your assets." "My home is not an asset, David. It is my life." The words tore from my throat, raw and ragged. "It is your father's legacy. You do manage a legacy by selling it to the highest bidder." "It's for Chloe," he blurted out, the justification he had clearly been coached to use. "Don't you want her to be happy? This wedding, it's the most important day of her life. We wanted to give her the world. This was the only way." The sheer, breathtaking selfishness of his statement stole my breath. He had weighed my past against his daughter's party, and the party had won. He spoke of Chloe's happiness as if it were a fragile, sacred thing that could only be purchased with my memories, my security, my heart. "And what about my happiness, David?" I whispered. "Did that factor into your calculations at all?" "Of course it did," he said, but his voice was hollow. "You have the bungalow, it's much more practical for you at your age. The upkeep on the lake house was getting to be too much. We were worried about you, all alone up there." The lie was so bald-faced, so insulting, it was almost laughable. They hadn't worried about me, they had assessed me. They had seen an old woman with an underutilized asset and they had liquidated it. I could hear Linda whispering urgently in the background, "Tell her about the money, tell her." "And the money, Mom," David said, his voice suddenly brighter, seizing on the new talking point. "The money is safe. I've put it into a trust for you. You'll be taken care of. You'll never have to worry about a thing." A trust? He sold my soul and offered me a stipend. He'd taken my independence and replaced it with a financial arrangement of his own design, one I had no doubt he and Linda would control. "I don't want to trust David," I said, my voice like ice. "I want my house. I want the life you stole from me." "You're being emotional," he said, a dismissive edge to his voice. "You're not thinking clearly. We did what was best for everyone." "Best for everyone?" I echoed. "You stood by and let your wife convince you to plunder your own father's memory for the sake of a champagne fountain and some expensive flowers. You looked at my love for you, my trust in you, and saw it as a tool to be used. You are a stranger to me, David, you're fat." Her would be so ashamed. That hit its mark. There was a sharp intake of breath followed by a choked sound. But before he could respond, Linda's voice came on the line, sharp and commanding. "Now you listen to me, Margaret," she snapped, having clearly snatched the phone from him. "We did what had to be done. Chloe deserves this. You've had your life, you have your memories, you can't live in the past. This money secures Chloe's future and yours. You should be thanking us, not guilting us." And with that, the line went dead. I sat in the deepening twilight, the phone still pressed to my ear. The silence it left behind was more profound than any before. It was the silence of a door slamming shut, of a bridge being burned, of a bond being irrevocably broken. They hadn't just sold my house. They had cut me out of their lives as neatly and efficiently as a surgeon excising a tumor. I was no longer a mother or a grandmother. I was a problem that had been solved. The drive back to the city was a blur of headlights and tears. I don't remember much of it, only the feeling of being hollowed out, a fragile shell with nothing inside. My bungalow, which had always felt cozy, now felt like a cage. Every object in it was a reminder of a life that no longer felt real. The photos on the mantelpiece of David as a boy, of Chloe's christening, of family Christmases were like relics from an archaeological dig, evidence of a civilization that had vanished. For 3 days, I didn't leave the house. I didn't answer the phone. I moved from the bed to the armchair and back again. Grief was a thick, suffocating fog. It wasn't just the loss of the house, it was the loss of my son. The David I knew, the little boy with scraped knees and a mischievous grin, was gone. In his place was a man I didn't recognize, a man who could justify the cruelest betrayal in the name of practicality. And the pain of that was a physical ache in my chest. I felt old, foolish, and utterly powerless. They had all the advantages, youth, money, and the cold-blooded certainty that they had done nothing wrong. I had only my memories, and even those were now tainted. On the 4th day, as I sat staring at a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking, my eyes fell upon a silver-framed photograph on the side table. It was of Robert and his best friend Arthur Finch standing arm in arm at a fishing tournament they'd won 30 years ago. They were both grinning, holding up a ridiculously large fish, the picture of health and happiness. Arthur. The name sparked something in the fog. Arthur Finch was the opposite of my son. Where David was malleable, Arthur was granite. He was a semi-retired lawyer who still kept a small, dusty office downtown, mostly, he claimed, to get away from his wife's gardening projects. He was sharp, curmudgeonly, and fiercely loyal. After Robert died, Arthur had called me every Sunday for a year just to make sure I was all right. Robert would have my hide if I didn't check on his girl, he'd grumble. The thought of calling him was daunting. It meant admitting the full, humiliating scope of what had happened. It meant speaking the betrayal aloud to someone who had loved Robert as much as I did. But as I looked at the photograph, at Arthur's steady, laughing eyes, I realized he was the only person in the world who would understand the depth of this sacrilege. My hand was shaking as I looked up his number and dialed. His voice answered on the second ring, a gravelly bark. Finch. "Arthur," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's Margaret Peterson." There was a slight pause. "Maggie, is everything all right? You sound terrible." And just like that, the dam broke. The carefully constructed wall of numb silence I had built around myself crumbled, and I began to sob, great, gulping, undignified sobs that shook my entire body. I told him everything, the words pouring out in a chaotic, grief-stricken torrent. The sign, the padlock, the phone call with David, Linda's chilling final words, the power of attorney. I told him about the wedding, the house his best friend had built, the feeling of being erased. He didn't interrupt, he just listened. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing on the other end of the line, a steady, patient presence. When I finally ran out of words, exhausted and empty, there was a long silence. "That," Arthur finally said, and his voice was low and tight with a fury that was almost terrifying. "That cowardly, money-grubbing son of a—" He cut himself off, taking a deep, calming breath. "Maggie, I want you to get a pen and paper." "What for?" I sniffled. "You're going to write down the name of that realty company. You're going to write down everything you remember about that power of attorney. And then you are going to get in your car and drive to my office. Do you understand me?" His tone was no longer just comforting, it was commanding. It was the voice of a man who saw a wrong and was already formula. Ting a way to write it. For the first time in days, a tiny, fragile flicker of something other than despair ignited within me. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more primal. It was the will to fight. "Yes, Arthur," I said, my voice a little stronger now. "I understand." "Good," he grunted. "And Maggie, stop crying. We're not going to be sad, we're going to be angry, and then we're going to get even." Robert would have expected nothing less. He was right. Robert would never have stood for this. He would have been heartbroken, yes, but then he would have been furious. He would have fought for our home, for our legacy. And in that moment, sitting in my lonely bungalow with the phone in my hand, I felt a new resolve settle over me. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was Robert's wife, and I would not let them get away with this. Arthur's office was exactly as I remembered it. A chaotic symphony of leather-bound books, teetering stacks of manila folders, and the faint, pleasant smell of old paper and pipe tobacco. He greeted me at the door not with a hug, but with a firm hand on my shoulder and a look of such grim determination that it bolstered my own fledgling resolve. He led me to a worn leather armchair, poured me a cup of tea that was strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and sat down behind his massive oak desk. "All right, Maggie," he said, "all business. Let's go to war." For the next 2 hours, he questioned me with a lawyer's precision. He made me recount every detail, every conversation. He was especially interested in the power of attorney. "Was it a durable power of attorney or a springing one?" he asked, peering at me over his spectacles. I don't know, Arthur. It was just a form. Linda said it was for emergencies if I got sick." Arthur grunted, a sound of deep disgust. A springing power of attorney only becomes effective upon a specific event, like a doctor declaring you incapacitated. A durable one is effective the moment you sign it. I'd bet my last dollar that snake-in-the-grass daughter-in-law of yours had you sign a durable one. It gave David the legal right to act as you, to sign his name as if it were your own. In the eyes of the law, the sale was likely legal. My heart sank. So there's nothing we can do. I didn't say that, he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. Legal doesn't mean right, and it doesn't mean they can't be held accountable. He may have had the authority to sell, but he also had a fiduciary duty to act in your best interest. And I'm going to argue that liquidating your primary emotional and historical asset to fund a quarter-life crisis party for his spoiled daughter was a catastrophic breach of that duty. We're not just going after the value of the house, Maggie. We're going after them for conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We're going to make them pay for every tear you shed. The legal terms were foreign to me, but the intent was crystal clear. Over the next week, Arthur was a whirlwind of activity. He made calls, he filed paperwork, he hired a private investigator to track the money from the sale of the house. The investigator's report was sickeningly efficient. The house had sold for $450,000, a fair market price. The money had been deposited into a new account opened by David. From there, a series of large payments had been made: $40,000 to a wedding venue, $25,000 to a caterer, $15,000 to a florist, $20,000 to a designer for Chloe's dress. It was all there in black and white, a ledger of my family's betrayal. My role was to dig through my own history. At Arthur's direction, I gathered old photographs of the house being built, handwritten letters from Robert describing his progress, property tax receipts going back 40 years. Each item was a fresh stab of pain, but with each one my resolve hardened. I was no longer a victim. I was a plaintiff. I was building a case not with legal jargon, but with the evidence of a life lived, a life that had value far beyond its market price. As the day of the wedding approached, Arthur laid out his plan. It was simple, brutal, and perfectly timed. "We'll file the lawsuit the Friday before the wedding," he explained, leaning back in his chair. "But we won't serve them the papers right away. We'll also file for a temporary restraining order and an asset freeze. Given the clear evidence of them misspending your money, the judge is almost certain to grant it ex parte. That means their bank accounts will be frozen before they even know what's hit them. The final payments to the vendors are always due the week of the wedding. When they go to make those payments, the funds won't be there." It was a cold-blooded strategy, and a small, grandmotherly part of me flinched. This would not just disrupt the wedding, it would decimate it. It would humiliate Chloe in front of all her friends. Arthur must have seen the flicker of doubt in my eyes. He leaned forward, his expression softening. "Maggie, these are not good people. They didn't just make a mistake. They made a calculated decision to sacrifice your well-being for their own vanity. They left an 81-year-old woman to discover her life sanctuary had been sold from under her by finding a sign on the lawn. They deserve no mercy. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice. It's about consequences." He was right. This wasn't about being cruel. It was about holding them accountable in the only language they seemed to understand: money and social standing. "What's the final step?" I asked, my voice steady. "The final step," Arthur said with a grim smile, "is the confrontation. I found out from my investigator that they're having a final planning meeting with the wedding coordinator at their house on Saturday afternoon, the day before the wedding. We're going to crash it. We'll have the process server with us. They will be served with the lawsuit in front of the very person whose job it is to create their perfect day. We're going to hand them the bill for what they've done, right in the middle of their victory lap." I took a deep breath. The thought of facing them, of seeing the looks on their faces, was terrifying. But the thought of letting them celebrate their triumph, paid for with my husband's legacy, was unbearable. "Okay, Arthur," I said, "let's do it." The drive to David and Linda's house felt like the drive to the lake, but in reverse. Instead of heading toward peace and solitude, I was driving into the heart of a storm I had helped create. Arthur sat in the passenger seat, a thick leather briefcase on his lap containing the lawsuit. He was silent, projecting an aura of calm, righteous power that I drew on like a lifeline. The process server, a nondescript man named Mr. Cole, followed in a separate car. David and Linda lived in a massive beige brick house that I'd always thought looked more like a bank than a home. As we pulled up, I could see the signs of the impending celebration. A large floral arrangement, no doubt costing a small fortune, sat on the porch. The lawn was impeccably manicured. Everything was perfect. Everything was a lie. Arthur put a hand on my arm before we got out of the car. "Let me do the talking at first, Maggie. Stay calm, you'll know when it's your time to speak." I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. We walked up the stone pathway, Arthur's confident strides a stark contrast to my own trembling steps. He rang the doorbell. David opened the door, a strained but celebratory smile plastered on his face. "Mom, what a surprise!" His eyes darted to Arthur and his smile faltered. "Arthur, what are you doing here?" "Hello, David," Arthur said, his voice level. "We have some business to discuss. I believe you're in a meeting." Before David could answer, Linda appeared behind him, her face a mask of social grace. "Margaret, we were just talking about you. The wedding coordinator is here. Come in, come in." She tried to usher me inside, completely ignoring Arthur. "I think Mr. Finch should come in too," I said, finding my voice. Linda's eyes narrowed, but the presence of the coordinator, a chic woman in her 40s who was now standing in the foyer, forced her to maintain her composure. "Of course," she said through a tight smile, "the more the merrier." We entered the living room, a cavernous space with white furniture and abstract art. Chloe was sitting on a sofa, flipping through a bridal magazine, looking utterly radiant and oblivious. The coordinator, whose name was Paige, gave us a professional smile. "We were just finalizing the seating chart," Linda trilled, gesturing around the room. "It's all coming together so perfectly." "That's wonderful," Arthur said, placing his briefcase on the glass coffee table with a solid thud. "Because we're here to discuss a payment issue." Linda's smile vanished. "I beg your pardon, all our vendors have been paid on schedule." "I'm sure they have been," Arthur said smoothly. "But you see, there's been a slight problem with the source of your funds. The accounts from which you've been paying them have just been frozen by court order." The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe looked up from her magazine, a confused frown on her face. David went pale. Linda's face contorted into a mask of disbelief and rage. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. "That's impossible." "Oh, it's quite possible," Arthur said, opening his briefcase and removing a thick sheaf of papers. "This is a lawsuit filed by Margaret Peterson against David and Linda Peterson. It's for the sum of $450,000, representing the value of the property you illegally converted, plus another $500,000 in punitive damages for breach of fiduciary duty and intentional infliction of emotional distress." He slid the document across the table. David stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "Emotion. Al distress," Linda shrieked, her voice cracking. "We were helping her." "You were helping yourselves," Arthur countered, his voice like steel. "You preyed on an elderly woman's trust, sold her home, and used the proceeds to fund this spectacle. And as of 9 a.m. this morning, every dollar you have is locked up tighter than a drum." The wedding coordinator, Paige, was slowly backing toward the door, her eyes wide with horror. This was clearly not in her job description. Chloe finally spoke, her voice a bewildered whine. What's going on, Daddy? What does he mean the accounts are frozen? The final payment for the caterer is due today. David couldn't answer. He just sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. It was Linda who turned her fury on me. How could you? She spat, her face blotchy and red. How could you do this to your own family, to your own granddaughter? You've ruined her wedding, you've ruined everything. And that's when I knew it was my time. I stood up, feeling surprisingly steady. I looked past Linda, past David, and directly at my granddaughter. Your mother is wrong, Chloe, I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the silent room. I didn't ruin your wedding, your parents did. They did it the moment they decided that my home, the home your grandfather built with his bare hands, was worth less than 1 day of your life. I took a step closer, my eyes holding hers. That house was your legacy. It was where your father grew up. It was filled with love and memories. It was supposed to be a place for you and for your children, but they sold it. They took that history from you and from me, and they tried to buy you a new one made of expensive flowers and fancy food. A legacy should be built on love, Chloe, not on betrayal. I turned to David, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I loved you, David. I trusted you, and you used that love to break my heart. I hope this party was worth it. I then looked at Linda, whose face was a mask of pure hatred. I felt nothing for her, not anger, not pity, nothing. She was a void. Arthur signaled to Mr. Cole, who had been waiting silently in the foyer. The process server stepped forward and placed a copy of the lawsuit in Linda's hand, then another on the cushion next to the catatonic David. You've been served, he said politely, and then retreated. I looked around the room at the wreckage, the perfect family, the perfect house, the perfect wedding, all shattered. There was no triumph in it, only a deep, profound sadness, but beneath the sadness was a foundation of peace. I had done the right thing. I had stood up for Robert. I had stood up for myself. Let's go, Maggie, Arthur said softly. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. The lawsuit was settled out of court. They had no choice. They sold their big beige house and gave me back every penny from the sale of the lake house, plus a significant sum for damages. I never saw the lake house again. The new owners were a young family, and I hope they fill it with as much love as we did. I never spoke to David or Linda again. I heard through the grapevine that Chloe called off the wedding and moved across the country, away from them both. Maybe, in the end, she learned something about the true cost of things. I still live in my bungalow. It's quiet, but it no longer feels like a cage. It feels like my own space, bought and paid for with a strength I never knew I possessed. Sometimes I look at the old photo of Robert and me on the porch of the lake house and I feel a pang of loss, but it's no longer a crippling grief. It's a gentle sadness, a memory of a beautiful thing that was. My son taught me a terrible lesson. That family can be the source of your deepest pain. But Arthur and my own resolve taught me a better one. That legacy isn't just something you leave behind. It's something you must be willing to fight for. The house of wood and nails is gone, but the foundation Robert built inside of me of love, integrity, and strength proved to be stronger than any betrayal. They couldn't sell that.